Some people spend their whole lives trying to get ahead, only to wake up one day and realize they don't actually remember what they were rushing toward. The strange thing is, that realization rarely happens during the big moments. Not at funerals, not after a promotion, not during some dramatic life collapse. Most of the time, it happens quietly, maybe while sitting in traffic after work, maybe while reheating dinner alone, maybe while staring at a phone screen at midnight, exhausted for reasons that have nothing to do with sleep. For Daniel Mercer, it happened beside a fishing dock just after sunrise. On a morning, he almost didn't stop. Daniel was 52 years old and permanently tired. Not the kind of tired that disappears after a weekend. The deeper kind. The kind that settles into a man after years of carrying responsibilities without ever setting them down. He lived outside Portland in a narrow 2-story house with peeling paint and a garage full of unfinished projects. His wife, Claire, had passed away 3 years earlier after a long fight with cancer. Since then, the house had become painfully quiet. His son lived in Chicago. His daughter called when she could. Most evenings, Daniel ate dinner standing at the kitchen counter. He worked as a regional sales manager for a plumbing supply company. It paid well enough. The job wasn't terrible, but every day felt exactly the same. Coffee, traffic, emails, meetings, microwave dinners. Late-night television he barely watched, and somewhere along the way, life had stopped feeling like life. One Thursday morning, Daniel was driving to an early client meeting near the coast when traffic slowed unexpectedly near a small marina. Annoyed, he checked the dashboard clock. 7:12 a.m. He tapped the steering wheel impatiently. Then he noticed something strange. Nobody else seemed frustrated. The people near the dock moved slowly, calmly. An older man in rubber boots sat on an overturned bucket, repairing a fishing net, like he had nowhere else to be. A younger guy unloaded crates while whistling softly to himself. No rushing, no phones, no visible panic. It irritated Daniel more than it should have. He pulled into a nearby coffee stand, mostly out of frustration. The girl at the window handed him his drink and smiled. Beautiful morning, huh? Daniel glanced at the gray sky. Sure. He drove a little farther, then, for reasons he couldn't explain, pulled over beside the marina. Maybe he needed air. Maybe he just didn't want to walk into another meeting pretending he cared about quarterly numbers. The ocean smelled cold and metallic. Gulls cried overhead. Wooden boats rocked gently against the dock with soft knocking sounds that reminded him of childhood summers he hadn't thought about in years. That's when he saw the fisherman. He looked to be around 70. Thick beard, weathered hands, heavy green jacket faded by salt and sun. The old man sat near the edge of the dock, drinking coffee from a metal thermos. Not doing much, just watching the water. Daniel walked past him at first. Then the fisherman spoke without looking over. You look like somebody trying to outrun something. Daniel stopped. Normally, he hated conversations like this. Random strangers trying to sound wise. But something about the man's tone felt different. Not theatrical, not intrusive, just observant. Daniel gave a tired smile. Just work. The fisherman nodded slowly as if he'd heard that answer 1,000 times. Work'll take everything you offer it, he said, and still ask why you aren't giving more. Daniel looked out at the water. That sounds about right. For a moment, neither man spoke, only the creaking dock, the gulls, the distant hum of engines. Then Daniel checked his watch instinctively. The fisherman noticed. You late for something important. Daniel opened his mouth, then hesitated. A sales meeting, coffee stand, conference room, PowerPoint slides. Nobody cared about. No, he admitted quietly. The old man smiled faintly. Thought so. Daniel should have left then, but he didn't. Instead, he sat down on a nearby crate. The fisherman introduced himself as Walter. He'd spent nearly 40 years working the same stretch of coastline, salmon mostly, and crab during the colder seasons. Daniel expected stories about adventure or hardship. Instead, Walter asked simple questions. Got kids? Yeah. They doing okay? I think so. You talk to him much? Daniel looked down at his coffee. Not enough. Walter nodded gently, like he understood more than Daniel had actually said. The conversation drifted slowly after that. About weather, about boats, about how mornings felt different near the ocean. And gradually, Daniel realized something uncomfortable. He couldn't remember the last time he'd sat still without feeling guilty. Even now, part of his brain kept whispering, "You should go. You're wasting time. You're falling behind." Walter suddenly pointed toward the horizon. See that? A small fishing boat moved through the morning fog. Daniel shrugged. Boat? Walter chuckled. That kid driving it bought his father's business after the old man got sick. So the old man spent 30 years missing dinners, birthdays, anniversaries, because he thought he was building something for his family, Walter Pousset. Then one day he realized his family mostly learned how to live without him. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Walter took another sip of coffee. Happens more than people think. The words landed harder than Daniel expected, because Claire used to say something similar. Years ago, she'd once stood in their kitchen while he answered work emails during dinner. She looked at him quietly and asked, "Are we eventually supposed to matter more than all this?" At the time, he'd been irritated. Now, standing beside cold ocean water years later, he couldn't stop hearing her voice. Over the next few weeks, Daniel kept returning to the marina. Sometimes before work, sometimes on weekends. He told nobody about it. Walter never offered dramatic advice. Most days, they just talked, or sat in silence. Oddly, the silence became Daniel's favorite part. No expectations, no performance. No pressure to be productive every second. One rainy morning, Daniel arrived, looking exhausted. Walter noticed immediately. Bad night. Daniel laughed bitterly. Bad year. Walter waited. And eventually, the truth came out. How guilty Daniel felt after Claire died. How much time he'd spent working while she sat alone during treatments. How he kept telling himself he'd slow down later. After things settled. After retirement. After the next promotion. But later had arrived without asking permission. And Claire wasn't there anymore. The doc stayed quiet for a long time after that. Finally, Walter spoke. My wife died 12 years ago. Daniel looked over, surprised. Walter stared at the water. Know what scared me most afterward? Daniel shook his head, that I couldn't remember the sound of her laugh right away. The sentence broke something open inside Daniel, not because it was dramatic, because it was honest, painfully honest. Walter rubbed his hands together against the cold. You spend enough years distracted. Eventually, life stops waiting for your attention. Daniel looked away quickly, eyes burning. Winter came early that year. The marina grew quieter. One morning, Daniel arrived and found Walter's usual spot empty. For some reason, the absence unsettled him more than he expected. He waited nearly 20 minutes before asking another fisherman if Walter was around. The man looked confused. You didn't hear? Daniel felt his stomach drop. Hear what? Heart attack last week. The world suddenly felt very still. Is he? He's alive. Recovering at his daughter's place upstate. Doctors told him no more boats for a while. Daniel nodded slowly. Relief, mixed strangely with fear. Because for the first time in years, someone had genuinely changed the direction of his life. And Daniel hadn't even realized it was happening. That afternoon, instead of driving back to the office, Daniel pulled into his daughter's neighborhood 2 hours away. He hadn't called ahead. When she opened the door, she looked shocked. Dad. Daniel smiled awkwardly. Thought maybe we could get lunch. Her expression softened, and for the first time in years, Daniel noticed something painful. She looked relieved to see him, as if she'd been waiting for this version of her father to come back. The changes afterward were small. That's the part people usually misunderstand about healing. It rarely arrives all at once. Daniel still worked, still paid bills, still had lonely nights, but he stopped volunteering for every extra assignment. He started calling his son every Sunday. He fixed the old porch Claire used to complain about. He began cooking actual meals instead of microwaving frozen dinners. And sometimes, early in the morning, he drove to the marina with coffee and simply watched the water. No urgency, no reason, just presence. Months later, Walter eventually returned, slower now, thinner, but still carrying that same calmness. Daniel brought him coffee one morning and asked a question that had quietly lived inside him for months. How'd you figure it out? Walter frowned slightly. Figure what out? How to be happy. The old fisherman laughed softly to himself. Then he looked out over the ocean. I don't think happiness is something you catch once and keep forever. The wind moved gently across the dock. Walter continued. I think it's just moments where you finally stop fighting your own life. Daniel stood quietly beside him, and somehow, that answer felt more real than anything he'd heard in years. A lot of people watching this probably know the feeling Daniel carried. The exhaustion, the constant pressure, the sense that life keeps moving faster, while the meaningful parts somehow grow quieter. And maybe the hardest part isn't suffering. Maybe it's realizing how easy it is to become emotionally absent from your own life, while technically doing everything right. Sometimes happiness doesn't arrive as excitement. Sometimes it arrives as relief. A slower morning. A phone call you almost postponed. Dinner with someone you love. 10 quiet minutes where your mind finally stops racing. Tiny things, easy to miss if you're always hurrying toward the next thing. If this story reminded you of someone, or maybe reminded you of a version of yourself you haven't seen in a long time, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, quiet stories about ordinary people carrying invisible things, consider subscribing. Take care of yourselves, and maybe, once in a while, let the morning be enough.